Predict, explain, control. For lots of people who grew up being taught about scientific theory, those are the three God terms, the three terms that separate good theory from not so good theory. A good theory should allow us to predict behavior, to explain behavior, and to control behavior. Now, keep in mind that that's a characteristic of scientific theory, not interpretive theory. But today we're talking about a post-positivist scientific theory or model that boasts a high degree of predictive power. It is probably most well known for its high predictive power. It is the brainchild of John and Julie Gottman, Gottman, and the model has come to be known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse model. Gottman and other colleagues over the years have hypothesized about the variables that they believe correlate most strongly to the outcome of divorce. And as a result of their work, they have compiled a list of four sets of behaviors, or four types of behaviors that lead Gottman to say with confidence, that lead John Gottman to say with confidence that he can observe a couple interacting for less than 20 minutes and he can tell you with at least 90% certainty whether that couple is going to divorce. Let's talk about that Four Horsemen model. Perhaps the most significant text associated with it was a Gottman text entitled What Predicts Divorce? In that text, Gottman divides couples into categories, that there are regulated couples and non-regulated couples. Now, regulated couples can include, for Gottman, couples that engage in validating communication styles with each other, and couples who engage in conflict avoidant interaction with each other, that they choose not to address conflict head on. This type also includes what he calls volatile interaction between the husband and wife. He's looked at traditional male-female couples. All of those three types meet his standards for regulated couples. They all engage in a certain degree of self-monitoring rather than just saying the first thing that pops into their heads without considering the impact of those statements. On the other end of the continuum, you have what we call non-regulated couples, or what he calls non-regulated couples. And those couples tend to interact with each other in a manner that is hostile. Now, it's easy for us to say that people who interact with each other in a hostile manner are probably more likely to end their relationship than people who don't. However, what Gottman et al. Contribute to our discussion about relationship termination is a more specific list of behaviors that they connect to hostility in relationships. Gottman argues that there are four horsemen, to borrow the biblical metaphor, that can predict the oncoming apocalypse, i.e., divorce. Those four horsemen for him are criticism, which he also calls complaints, contempt, so criticism/complaints, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Let's talk a little bit about each of those. Well, criticism and complaints are probably the easiest to describe. Simply personal attacks. You never give me flowers. You aren't sensitive. You aren't romantic. What have you. These acts of personal blaming are criticisms. Now, related to those is the notion of contempt. Contempt goes beyond criticism. It's rooted in criticism. Contempt is rooted in the negative thoughts about that we would use to criticize someone, but they go beyond that into statements designed to psychologically abuse the other person. We're expressing disregard for that person and dehumanizing them in the process. Again, so there's a link to criticism, but it's the next step beyond criticism. This might take the form of name calling or insults. And a direct correlate of this behavior, once we've entered this stage regularly, we start to see a decrease in the attraction and admiration between two people. That takes us to our next stage, that third stage, defensiveness. By the time we get past the criticism and contempt stages, we're now at a point where people generally feel as though they're being attacked constantly, whether through the deeds of their partner or the words of their partner. And well, if someone feels as though they're being constantly attacked, it seems logical that they would shift their position, their relational position, in interaction with their partner to one in which they are ready to protect themselves. And so we see a change in the ways in which they interact with each other when they engage in this defensive talk. Both partners feel as though they're being victimized by the other, so they want to, in a sense, kind of cover up. So what we see here is a little less communication than we did in those other stages. We don't want to communicate as much because we want to protect ourselves against attack, and we never know when something we say may be used as part of an attack against us. Then from there we see a logical step downward, I guess, because we're talking about a deteriorating relationship, into our fourth horseman, stonewalling. Stonewalling is what happens when we really just give up. We distance ourselves from our partners. We decide to cut off communication. Sometimes completely, sometimes nearly completely. It's when we give that person the cold shoulder, or when we only answer questions in short, even curt responses to each other. This is where we stop interacting with each other because we don't see any use in interacting with each other. If we don't feel as though we're being listened to, if we don't feel as though our opinion matters, then what's the use? That's why people resort to stonewalling. Now, this matters in psychology, obviously, in family psychology and family studies. It also matters for those of us who study communication because these stages, these four horsemen, manifest themselves in communication, in communicative behavior, in communicative actions. It's in those insults, it's in those statements of criticism. It's even during the stonewalling stage, during the withdrawal, the lack of communication, that we see these stages in action. Now, Gottman and his colleagues have formed the Gottman Institute based on this work, and they've had a lot of success. They've sold lots of books. They've probably made lots of money by demonstrating the ability to predict the behaviors that correlate to divorce, and by directing many couples to change their behaviors in ways that would make divorce less likely. Now, at this point, I need to be clear about something related to divorce. How do I put this as simply as I can? It is important to me that you keep in mind that not everyone regards divorce as a universally negative outcome. Sometimes a divorce is the best thing a couple can do. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about when we get to critiques of Gottman's model. It's one of the things that we need to bring up when we look at those critiques. Well, let's transition into talking about those critiques. At the top of the list, people who have critiqued Gottman's model praise the notion of its predictive power. A prediction rate of over 90% is nothing to sneeze at. Now, having said that, there are some shortcomings, some areas that warrant more attention and that warrant improvement. And this is what we do when we build theory, so it's not it doesn't mean that I hate the theory when I mention that scholars have found some shortcomings with it. For example, one of the things that the theory does by focusing on divorce as the only negative outcome is, well, it rules out the potential to predict negative behaviors in other types of relationships, other types of committed relationships, in relationships where people aren't legally married but cohabiting, for instance. People who have tried to implement, people who have tried to replicate Gottman's work with cohabiting couples have found that they don't have the same level of success. Perhaps in part because marriage has a unique meaning in our culture that is distinct from the meaning of living together for two people. And so the termination of one of those relationships is maybe qualitatively different from the termination of the other. But in any case, in any event, it's worth noting that Gottman's work has been limited to married couples. When Gottman and the Institute cite that 90% success rate, they're talking about married people and the likelihood that they can predict divorce. Now, there is another critique there related to that 90% rate. Yes, it's a high degree of predictive power, but because of the field in which Gottman works, Gottman is speaking, interacting with, studying mostly people in distressed marriages. So it may be a little bit easier to predict that those marriages aren't going to work out in the long run, as opposed to, say, interacting with couples engaging in premarital counseling and then trying to predict whether they would divorce at that same 90% clip. That would be a lot more difficult, some would argue, because Gottman and company are usually studying people who are headed towards divorce, who are struggling in their relationships. Now, other people have argued that that the model doesn't take into consideration multiple relational types. They don't look at same-sex relationships, for instance. Others have argued that the model tends to downplay the role of some key variables, some demographics like race and culture, and some like religion, that because of different religious beliefs, the idea of divorce may be different to some people than it is to others. Um, there are some people for whom, I, I immediately can think of a friend of mine who did not get divorced and to this day is just separated long term from her husband because it would mean that she would no longer be able to participate in the church activities she participates in. So instead of divorcing, she has been separated from her partner for over 2 decades now. Oh my goodness. And as I mentioned earlier, there's no universal claim that divorce is just a horrible, horrible thing. There are cases in which people get divorces to get out of physically abusive relationships. And certainly, far be it from me to say that those people should stay, or that that staying together is the only is a positive outcome, let alone the only or the most positive outcome. So the theory, so Gottman's Four Horsemen model does tell us a good deal about a small section of kind of traditional married couples. It gives us a kind of list of behaviors to avoid, and in training and therapy with the Gottmans, people learn skills to counteract those four horsemen, ways to speak to each other that don't involve as much criticism, ways to express oneself without resorting to contempt or name calling, and those things have been shown to increase the likelihood that couples will stay together. Having said that, it's a theory that has its usefulness and a theory that still has a way to go. After all, 9 out of 10 is one short of 10 out of 10.